Hey everybody, Daniel from Spacedock here, back with another unscripted top 5 video, this time looking at the warships of those who march beneath the Raptor's wings in the top 5 classes of Romulan Warbird. And let's get right into it. First up, in 5th place, it's what Star Trek Online calls the Tillis-class bird of prey, but is generally known as the Star Trek The Original Series Romulan bird of prey from the episode Balance of Terror, most prominently. Generally speaking, I'm not normally a huge fan of the original series aesthetic for ship design. I think it was improved tremendously in later series, but this ship, as much in lore as in design, is really awesome, because it's the first glimpse we get into the concept of birds of prey, which is a great name for a great style of ship in this universe, something that was later adapted by the Klingons and became more their thing really, but was originally set up by the Romulans as a sort of submarine in space. Fast and nimble, reliant entirely on its cloaking device, and used to bushwhack ships far larger than itself in lethal hit-and-run attacks. The episode Balance of Terror is all the evidence you need of how narratively interesting this concept is. The Enterprise simply having a fight with a Romulan ship similar to the Enterprise itself would have been nowhere near as interesting as this fantastic Hunt for Red October style game of cat and mouse that we get in the actual episode, with the battle of wits between the Romulan commander and Kirk. All of that comes from the unique design and combat approach of the Romulan bird of prey. Also, in a series that was very simplistic in its hull decals for most of the show, the Romulan bird of prey here does have this awesome decal across its ventral surface with the large bird of prey, the first in many hints toward Romulan iconography that plays into all of their designs going forward. The ship is 150 meters long, 90 meters wide. As we see in Balance of Terror, it relies largely on plasma torpedoes, although we also hear that it's equipped with various nuclear weapons, although the lore later changed about the Federation-Romulan War in such a way that doesn't really fit that level of technology, but that's the nature of prequel stories. Apparently it can carry 2 shuttlecraft, though I don't see any particular space for them on the design. I assume there's some kind of retractable small bay somewhere. And like almost all cloaked vessels in Star Trek, the ship can only fire when decloaked, something that Kirk and the crew of the Enterprise eventually get their heads around and use against the Klingon bird of prey in Star Trek 3 to counterattack just as it's about to decloak and fire. A really cool design that played an irreplaceable role in what is possibly the best episode of the original series and laid the groundwork for an awesome lineage of ships for the rest of the Star Trek franchise. Great stuff. In 4th place, we have the Reman Warbird Scimitar, which according to beta canon later became the Romulan Scimitar-class Warbird as they adapted the design. This is, without a shadow of a doubt, a big stupid bad guy ship, in the same vein as the Vengeance and the Narada from the JJ movies. Although I think of all the times that Star Trek has dipped into truly silly bad guy ships, this is probably the most interesting and the most kind of appropriate for the Romulans in terms of its design. It still maintains that avian look, and it definitely has that intimidation factor that you're always going for when you design a big stupid bad guy ship. Apparently this was built in underground caves on Remus in an extremely short time without the Romulan Star Empire finding out, which seems stunningly improbable, but either way, this thing did come into existence and we got to see it in battle in Star Trek Nemesis. The Scimitar is 890 meters long and a rather whopping 1,350 meters wide. It can apparently maintain warp 9.7 and its armament includes 52 disruptor cannons, 27 torpedo launchers, and the Thaleron cascading biogenic pulse weapon that the plot of Star Trek Nemesis begins to center around in the 3rd act. The ship also has both primary and secondary shields, one of very few instances of layered shields we hear about in Star Trek, and a very, very advanced cloaking device that they only end up being able to bypass by means of Betazoid empathic shenanigans. This ship can fire while fully cloaked, and we even see it manually disengage parts of its cloak to lure adversaries into over-enthusiastic attacks and trap them, which frankly didn't seem hugely necessary as the Scimitar looked like it was pretty handily dealing with those 2 Warbirds, even without pulling any fancy tricks. And on top of all of that, the ship also carries a huge complement of Scorpion-class attack flyers, which is again another rare instance of something from Star Trek, in this case carrier functionality, which we don't normally see much of, normally because the Star Trek franchise is so dominated by perfectly accurate faster-than-light beam weapons that you have to wonder how tiny one-man fighters could ever be anything more than chaff when deployed into a battle like that, but apparently they found some use for them here because the Scimitar has a hell of a lot of them on board. As I said, this is just a very imposing and fan-servicey cool design for a Romulan ship. It certainly steps out of the more grounded and thoughtful boundaries of ship design in the franchise for the most part, but it has that Star Wars factor of just being impressive and awe-inspiring by its scale and power, and I think it certainly does a better job in that capacity than the USS Vengeance or the Narada ever did. I do wonder if, since the new Star Trek Picard show is apparently quite focused on the Romulan Star Empire or whatever came after the Star Empire, if we'll ever see any more Scimitar-class warbirds kicking about in the background somewhere. Would certainly be an interesting callback. Next up, in third place, we again have a ship that gets its only name from Star Trek Online, that being the Tavar Oh class light warbird, or bird of prey, which actually appeared in Star Trek Enterprise as its on-screen alpha canon appearance. So Star Trek Online seems to be implying that this ship has been in service for centuries upon centuries, or perhaps that a 25th century bird of prey is closely based on the design of this old 22nd century one. Either way, I think this is the coolest a bird of prey has ever looked in Star Trek. It's kind of the wrong approach for a prequel, because this ship, even when it appeared in Enterprise, looked far, far newer than the following 23rd century bird of prey ever did. Enterprise generally did a fairly good job of making things look like they could believably evolve into TOS, rather than already looking like they're far more advanced than TOS. But this is sadly an exception, as the Tavar Oh class looks like it's straight out of an episode of TNG. But from a purely objective design standpoint, that's fine, because this ship looks really, really cool. It's 296 meters long, 330 meters wide, so quite a lot larger than the Talis. It has these awesome curved kind of bladed green nacelles on the port and starboard. It maintains the same kind of central fuselage shape as the Talis class. Again, apparently carries one shuttlecraft with no visible bay on the surface. I can only assume there's another kind of retractable hidden compartment in there somewhere. The ship, like all Romulan birds of prey and almost all Romulan warships, carries a cloaking device, is armed with plasma torpedoes and plasma cannons, as well as medium-strength deflector shields. In the Enterprise episode we see this in, we get to see them operating in a pack and prowling around in formation, which looks very cool. It's a shame, I think, that we never got to see these as part of a larger, more versatile fleet flying escort for larger warbirds and such. Maybe we'll get something like that in the Star Trek Picard show. Either way, this is definitely my favourite small Romulan warship design, and even if it is a bit of a continuity mess to include it in Star Trek Online, I'm glad that they did, because it doesn't look out of place and it adds a really awesome looking ship to the Romulan lineup. In second place, the ship that you probably think of when you think of the Romulan Star Empire, the Diderodex B-type class warbird. This is our first reintroduction to the Romulans after their exile between the original series era and the Next Generation, and this ship really does send a message when it first appears. By virtue of just being enormous, the ship is 1,041.65 meters long and 772.43 meters wide, dwarfing the Galaxy-class Enterprise D when stacked against it in early TNG. And also from the uniqueness of its space frame, this ship is dominated by an enormous negative space in the center, behind this large beaked prow section, which we can see is stacked with windows of many, many decks. The logic behind this negative space is from a rule that apparently once existed in the Star Trek ship design production teams, that all warp nacelles always needed to have line of sight with one another. You can also see instances of this logic in the Ferengi Marauder, where its ventral surface is very, very slightly curved so that the inlaid nacelles can still see each other, as apparently it was thought this was necessary for the warp drive to work in the earlier series Bible. This concept was later binned when the USS Defiant came along, which has the entire mass of its ship between its nacelles, and then we got many more ships afterwards that have interfered line of sight between nacelles. But either way, that was the logic for the design of the Diderodex class, and it made for a very, very unique and striking image for these new Romulan warbirds. The ship carries a crew of 1,500 across 63 decks. It can maintain warp 9.6 and is armed with 6 disruptor arrays, 2 photon torpedo launchers, and a shield inversion beam. The warbird is very well shielded and carries a cloaking device, and is generally portrayed as a hulking, slow-turning battleship capable of bringing a huge amount of firepower to bear when necessary. We can see these small shuttle bays on the ventral hull at this curved section, which apparently contain 16 shuttlecraft and up to 8 shuttle pods. This ship is in service for a very long time throughout Star Trek. It's the dominant mainstay Romulan design that we see all through the series, and it never really stops being imposing by sheer size and scale, even long after its introduction. Very cool, very unique design, one of the most memorable in the entire Star Trek franchise, I think. And in first place, continuing the theme of Star Trek having no idea what the hell any of its ships are called, it's the Moguy class stroke Valdor class stroke Nirexan class stroke Venator class Warbird. Whatever the hell this thing's called, it's really, really cool, and while I think most Trek fans prefer the Diderodex, this one wins out for me, as I think it's like the ultimate refined version of the Romulan avian style of ship design. It's essentially the top half of a Diderodex stretched out with a more pronounced beaked prow section, a longer wingspan, and underslung nacelles on the wingtips. The ship is 603 meters long and around 900 meters wide, with a crew of 900. We see in Star Trek Nemesis that the ship leans heavily on disruptor cannons rather than beams, and is extremely, almost startlingly maneuverable and fast for its size. There are some really gorgeous sequences of this thing in combat in the Battle of the Basin Rift, and I do think it's a real shame that this ship only showed up for one film, as it just has such a gorgeous screen presence when it's moving around in the battle, and I would love to see it more in future if they decide to use older ship designs in Star Trek Picard at any point, as I imagine this ship would probably still be in service if it was only just introduced in time for the Battle of the Basin Rift. There's not a huge amount I can say about this because there's so little information from its only appearance, but I definitely think this is the apex of the Romulan aesthetic in universe. I wish it had been introduced earlier so we could see these things during the Dominion War, or other opportunities for them to be shown off in canon. Not sure how likely it is, but fingers crossed for this ship appearing again at some point in future, and maybe they'll even decide what the hell it's called. Thank you for watching. This is Daniel from Spacedock, signing off. Thank you for watching Spacedock. If you're interested in supporting the channel, please do check out the links on the screen right now or in the description below for our Patreon and channel membership services. Anything you can pledge goes towards improving our team and our equipment and allowing us to put together bigger and more exciting video projects for you guys on the channel.